Hello, everyone. Uh, Let me offer you a warm welcome, even if virtually, to the World Trade Organization. Uh, Thank you very much for joining us for this uh, webinar on patents, biotechnology and biodiversity. This is part of the series of webinars that we are holding to register the fact that the WTO, this organization, is now 25 years old, and therefore the legal instruments, the agreements that form part of the WTO also have reached the 25-year mark. We're very grateful to you for joining us. We have a really remarkable range of registrations and participation in this webinar. We very much hope that it will be of interest and value to you. What's this webinar series about? It's essentially to recognize that we now have 25 years of practical experience in working with what's called the TRIPS agreement, the WTO's agreement in the area of intellectual property. And as we all know, this is a hugely dynamic area of law and policy with a wide range of experience from across the globe. We felt it would be helpful to reflect on what's been happening out there, to have a sense of what the current issues and the current experience is in this area, and maybe to throw open ideas for an ongoing conversation about this critical area. I want to make clear that the webinars are really a background conversation. They're not intended to be part of or intrude on the proper conversation that takes place inside these walls between our member governments. This is a background exploration of practical experience. It's not part of the formal conversation between our member governments. That's very much in their hands. We're simply the Secretariat that provide a supporting role. That's why I think we've turned to 5 really remarkable experts in this area to help us review, think through the experience in the last over the last 25 years, and to help us think about future directions. The theme of this webinar centers very generally on a particular element of the WTO TRIPS agreement, the area concerning patents, and in particular what we can generally call the area of biotechnology and the protection of also new plant varieties. This was singled out, if you like, in the agreement in our treaty as an area of particular attention, and indeed it is the subject of a particular review, as I say, undertaken by our members amongst themselves at the level of government to government conversation, dialogue. But it opened up a very significant debate, really almost from the beginning, about the proper approach to patenting of biotechnology, a matter that's of enormous importance and sensitivity that has attracted a diverse range of approaches in many jurisdictions, and indeed the TRIPS agreement, the WTO agreement in this area, consciously leaves open a range of options, a range of approaches for individual countries to pursue. And I think it's fair to say the initial attention was on the question of patents. What kind of patents should or should not be available in the field of, generally speaking, biotechnology? What should be the approach to recognizing, in particular, innovation in the agricultural field? But we saw this debate open up more broadly, most notably to consider the interaction with the area of biodiversity and the protection of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. This is, of course, governed internationally by a completely distinct treaty, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which we'll hear about later. And so the discussion about the TRIPS agreement broadened to consider the interaction between the somewhat technical area of patent law and the broader question of the protection of genetic resources and biodiversity, and in particular, the approach taken to equitable sharing of benefits from the exploitation of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. And so a progressive opening of the discussion. And beyond that, also a debate not only about should or should there not be patents as such, but how should patents be deployed in this area, if you like? How should patent rights be used in a very complex and ever-changing innovation ecosystem? So these are all, each one of these topics is itself not only the subject of a seminar, but really the subject of a conference. You know, these are complex, diverse areas. But we are conscious that a great deal has happened in each of these areas in a diverse way across the globe in the 25 years since this organization was established, since the TRIPS agreement came into effect. And reflecting on that period, we thought it would be helpful to hear from a range of recognized experts their specific perspectives on each of these issues. We can't possibly, in an event like this, do justice to the full range of perspectives, experiences, concerns, the different approaches taken in our 164 member governments. It would be impossible to do so. The purpose of this webinar is really to refresh the conversation, to learn from recognized experts in the field, to get a practical sense of current developments, if you like, as an end in itself, to get a better sense of what has happened over this time and what possibly might, how things possibly might evolve in the future. It's an ambitious range of subjects to address in a very short space of time. And I should also acknowledge that for all of us, for all of humanity, a key issue, an overwhelmingly important issue at the moment is the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'd like to underscore that this webinar is looking at a very specific slice of area issues within the broad scope of biotechnology and agricultural innovation and public health. But this is not getting into the current work, the current discussions and debate in the WTO on the relationship between the TRIPS agreement and the COVID-19 pandemic in particular. There's a very intense, active debate at the moment between our member governments, and this webinar is not dealing with that area. That's not because we don't think it's important or vital or urgent. Far from it. But rather, it is being pursued in a different channel. And today's focus is on a range of specific issues in the biotech area as such, rather than looking at TRIPS and public health more broadly. So I hope that's clear. We were delighted, thrilled to get the acceptance of the panelists we invited today. In each case, it was our hope, our ideal that these individuals would be able to take part, and we were really overwhelmed by the positive response. I'm sure by the end of this webinar, you'll agree with our delight of being able to invite them there, because we have 5 leading experts with very diverse backgrounds, very diverse take on these issues. But in each case, I think a really solid practical understanding of the impact if I might say, in the real world, about the operation of the TRIPS agreement in the areas I've touched on: biotechnology, agricultural innovation, the link with biotech and public health. We have a limited amount of time, so I won't dwell on their CVs in detail, but I do encourage you to look at the material on our website, which does contain their full CVs, and you can see the rich experience, expertise that we're able to put before you today, and I thank them very warmly in advance. Our first speaker is Mr. Joe Damond, who is the Executive Vice President responsible for international affairs with Bio, a leading, of course, industry organization dealing with the biotechnology sphere, and therefore very well qualified to deal with our first theme, taking up the impact of the TRIPS agreement over the past 25 years on the development of biotechnology. We have a lot to get through in this session. We've asked each speaker to make a presentation for 20 minutes, and we would ask you to feed to us any questions or comments through the comments section or the Q&A section on the various platforms we're using. And what we're going to do is compile your questions and comments so that we can have a rich, final, more interactive conversation. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Joe Damond from Bio, from the biotech industry. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Tony. Very honored to be here today, to be presenting on this really important and interesting topic. As was said, I'm here representing the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. We're the largest biotech organization in the world. We have about 1,000 member companies, also academic institutions. The large majority of them, probably 800 or so, are startup companies, which, as I will show, have a very deep connection to the TRIPS agreement. It's my thesis today that the global biotechnology sector, which is incredibly innovative, growing incredibly quickly, would not be what it is today but for the TRIPS agreement and the web of secure and predictable intellectual property rights that it has created over the last 25 years. In fact, as I go to my first slide, you will see that both the TRIPS and the global biotech sector are about the same age. They're both members of the millennial generation. My organization was founded in about late 1993. TRIPS agreement came into force beginning of 95. You can see it was a small economic sector. It was mainly located in the US at that point, but that it has grown to now over, and this chart is a little old, but to over $400 billion across the various sectors of parts of this sector, which includes not only the medicines, which I'm mainly going to focus on, and healthcare interventions, but also agriculture, and also increasingly climate-related and environmental applications. So the other thing it's given rise to, that's been created over the last 25 years that did not exist at all, is the biopharma ecosystem. And this is echoed in the other sectors as well, but you'll see how multifaceted it is here. There are startup companies, there are academic research institutions, healthcare institutions, government agencies such as patent and trademark offices, regulatory agencies, large pharma companies, importantly, venture capital companies that are taking the risky investments in this new technology. And I would urge all of you to view the little roads in this chart as actually representing the lifeblood of intellectual property itself. These transactions would not be taking place between collaborations between academic research institutions and startups, say, or between venture capitalists and startups, or between startups and larger pharma companies, if not for the predictability of the intellectual property rights as it represents. Because if you think about it, at the beginning of the life cycle of a new product, the only thing that exists is intellectual property rights, and somebody's being asked to make an investment in it. And those investments, those kinds of collaborations would not be taking place if not for the link of the IP. So IP is truly the lifeblood. If you think of these roads here as sort of being veins or arteries, it's not a bad analogy. I want to show how much the technology has developed quickly globally. And this is also, again, because of the research and development that's been spurred by the global IP system. Everybody's familiar, I think, with Moore's law about productivity in processing power of transistors. This is actually a logarithmic chart of productivity in DNA sequencing and synthesis. And you'll see that the growth starting later, but is basically just as rapid, or more so, and it doesn't even go up to 2020. So this is a tremendous increase in the ability of biotech to identify and treat genetic causes of diseases and illnesses. And it's been, again, this research and development has largely been made possible, and I'll get more to that, by the system, the IP system that we live in today, that we've lived in since the last, since the TRIPS agreement itself. I should say my own experience with TRIPS goes back to the very beginning, although just very tangentially. I was a junior trade official in the US government. I went to an actual TRIPS negotiating session, I think about 1987, and sat there in the back row as a junior trade official, but I've been familiar with it since its inception here. Now I want to talk about how the industry has developed and changed, because this is critical over the last 25 years. And I will link it back to the TRIPS agreement, but I think it's fundamental that people understand what the system looks like today. And then we can discuss, and I will in the course of this discuss, what the connections to TRIPS are. So, and this is largely, as you saw, the increase has been logarithmic. So it's actually accelerated in the last 10 or 15 years in terms of development of new technologies and their applications. But there are two chief trends I want to draw out here. One is the rise of startups and small companies, and the second is rise of new technologies, new applications. So the rise of small companies, this I think is something that people don't quite understand, or understand how important they've become. Bio has done a survey globally and counts about 3,300 global, what we call emerging biopharma companies. These are companies that are actually doing research and development, not just marketing or commercial. They have to actually be doing R&D. Incredibly, importantly, those emerging companies now represent 73%, almost 3/4 of late stage research and development, compared to just half about 15 years ago. And they represent 84% of early stage research. So in other words, research and development in biotechnology has now been outsourced or fanned out. What used to be a global pharmaceutical industry is now fanned out into hundreds and hundreds, or 3,300 to be exact, or more or less exact, all over the world. And it's growing tremendously. The number of molecules under development grew, even though they were already large, grew by 15% in each of the last couple of years. And now these small companies account for 2/3 of all the clinical trials. Again, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, these used to be dominated by the large pharma companies. Now 2/3 of them are being conducted by small companies, and these small companies increasingly are taking these products all the way to regulatory approval. When I talk about launch here, sometimes in the past, they would be more apt to maybe license the drugs to a larger company, but now increasingly, they're taking them all the way to regulatory approval. Let's talk about the rise of new technology, because this has also been incredibly dramatic. Global financing for gene and cell therapies, which are some of the newest technologies, dealing with engineering genes and cells to treat specific genetic mutations that cause disease, has more than doubled, to about $10 billion a couple of years ago. It's increased since then. Gene and cell clinical trials increased 27% in 1 year. Again, these numbers need to be updated a little bit, but they continue to increase at a similar rate. And now gene therapy is the largest class of biologic products in the pipeline. So more than double the number of monoclonal antibodies, which is sort of the first generation of biologics that are now in the market. These are new types of technologies. Like, we could have a whole session on the implications of those for patients and access, and the issues that are going to be created there. The forecast is that global gene and cell therapy will grow to about $35 billion market in another 5 years, or about 22% compound annual growth. Similarly, what we've seen in the last 10 years or so is an explosion of global venture capital funding. You'll see these bar charts here. The blue part of the chart represents US venture capital. The US is still dominant in this sector, in this part, which was one of the reasons why the US has still the world's largest biotech economic sector. But you'll also see the green part of the bar charts here, which are ex-US, outside of the US, primarily Europe and Asia. And you'll see that in 2000, the growth is about a quadrupling from 2009 to 2018. And it's about plateaued at $18 billion a year since then. This is a focus on what's outside the US. And again, very tiny amounts, 2009, about $1 billion. It's quintupled since then to 2018, 2020. And interestingly, it says here, Asia has surpassed Europe. Actually, in the last 2 years, they're sort of flipping back and forth, Europe and Asia, or about equivalent to the amount of venture capital being raised. The growth rates are, I would say, more or less similar. The Asian venture capital is dominated by China, but not exclusively. This again shows the rise of gene therapies just in the last several years, since just 2015. The clinical pipeline increasing from about 100 products to a couple of hundred, over 200 in the last several years. And these products will be coming out of the pipeline, although there's a great high failure rate, as I'll explain, but in the next several years. What I want people here to focus on, for the purpose of considering the contribution of TRIPS, is this chart here. The development of gene therapies are on the rise and occur on a global scale. You see in the bottom right-hand corner, the United States is the largest single country with 338 active clinical projects, followed by China, and then Europe, and every other region of the world has some part of this. But I also want you to focus on the left part of this pie chart. Global means that these are cross-border, multi-regional clinical trials or clinical development projects. So almost half of the projects in gene and cell therapy now are cross-border between the US and other countries, China, Europe, other countries. And that is a network. What that is telling us is that is a network of global collaboration. That network of global collaboration is only made possible by the predictability, transparency, strength of intellectual property protection across borders. That part of the pie chart would be far, far smaller and far less global, if not for the TRIPS agreement, would be my contention. I want to talk about now some of the concrete evidence, just to indicate how global this has become. And this is representing the experience of my own organization, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. We host a gathering every year of the global biotech sector. I want to show you how vibrant and international this has become, and that everybody has a stake in this. This is the last couple of years, as I've said, we've not been able to hold a biotech convention in person because of COVID. We couldn't hold it last year, nor will we be able to hold it this year. The last one that I have here for numbers is 2018, in which we had 18,000 attendees from 67 countries. A key part of that meeting is partnering sessions, where we have software that matches up various companies and parties, or whether it be academic institutions or companies, with others and they have one-on-one meetings. In a 3-day period, we were able to host 46,000, over almost 47,000 one-on-one meetings from companies all over the world. In fact, we were certified by the Guinness World Book of Records, the largest number of one-on-one meetings in a conference ever. I also want to focus you on the right-hand side of this, that at the convention, we have 1,800 exhibitors and 51 domestic and international pavilions. So again, we have representatives from all over the world in this. The number continues to go up year on year. And you can see here the geographic dispersion of attendees now. 67 countries are now participating in this. They're only there because they want to be because they are part and want to be integrated into the global biotech ecosystem. So again, without TRIPS, I don't think you'd be seeing a lot of these dots on the map. This is the kind of collaboration that TRIPS has fostered. Now, even though these events are always held in the US, and travel to the US is pretty expensive from almost anywhere else in the world, almost 40% now of the participants are from outside the US. So, and that's been one of the faster growing portions of the international convention. And you can see some of the leading countries on the right side here. That changes year on year, who is in the lead. But you can see a mix of particularly Asian, European, and of course, North American companies in the lead. But there's a much more, if you go to the next 10, you would see more diversity in terms of geographic. We have exhibition space that runs the size of 3 football fields. And you can't really, this doesn't really do it justice, but you can see here all the countries that are represented at the Bio Convention. All these countries are doing, trying to promote research and development, are part of the global integrated system. So I want to summarize what my argument here is, why TRIPS played such an important part. And then I'm going to come to COVID, which Tony mentioned. First of all, the research and development in the first place would not be happening without the intellectual property rights. Now, the US, before TRIPS, of course, had a strong IP regime and was already doing a lot of, and led the world in research and development and in the economic sector. So we had a strong IP here in the US, which has since gone global. And that's the second point. The TRIPS agreement has made cross-border collaborations possible, the common system of IP protection, its predictability and enforceability. But I want to focus on a key part of this. This system has spurred the tremendous growth of global venture capital funding. No one lends money for these risky ventures without IP guarantees. In fact, there was a poll of global venture capitalists a few years ago and asked them what they look at when they're doing due diligence on investments. 100%, which is an incredible result to any poll, to say 100% said that intellectual property rights was at the top of their list in terms of what they're investing in, because that's all there is to invest in at these early stages. And recall, this is, I think you've probably seen other presentations like this, but I'm not going to focus on it here, that 90% of these projects, even when they reach human clinical trials, fail. So, and they take about a decade to be successful. So that's why it requires venture capital, people are willing to take a risk. And what they're taking the risk in is the IP. The other thing that's, I think, important to point out and to clear up some maybe misunderstandings is that this has also allowed the rise of VC, venture capital, which is dependent on IP, has also allowed the development of these projects past initial stages. Private financing is absolutely critical to the development of these new technologies and bringing them to market. It dwarfs public financing by at least 5 to 1. Public financing is very important from organizations like the NIH in the US, organizations in Europe, China, public organizations. But that public finances generally focuses on early stage research and development, preclinical. And if it gets past that stage, then you go to the private market, the so-called valley of death. The valley of death is when you get to human clinical trials past stage 1, and the expense of continuing development goes much higher, it gets much more expensive, and then that's where about 90% of these projects fail. If it were not for venture capital, or not for private capital, these projects would not be going past their initial stages. Governments simply do not have the literally hundreds of billions of dollars annually to finance thousands of projects that I outlined earlier. Now I want to focus on COVID. So this is a proof of concept of what we've created, which is also a term of art in the development field. The incredible, I would say, and somewhat untold response of the COVID pandemic. We're all familiar in general that there have been a number of vaccines developed in record time, but I want to show you the bigger picture here of what's gone on. This chart tells most of it, actually. In the first 16 weeks following the sequencing of the SARS-CoV virus, there were already 700 projects studying either vaccines or antivirals or other treatments for COVID. This was before public financing became necessary, or became available, I should say. People stepped into the breach. And the fact that there were 800 of, 700, now there's over 800, but in the first 16 weeks, we already had 700. 3/4 of those projects originated in small companies. They were not, you're reading stories in the newspapers, it's very important about the contribution of the large pharma companies in getting these vaccines out. But I want to stress that 3/4 of the actual development projects originated in small companies, about half of those in the US, and I'll come back to that in a second. This shows that now there's still about some of these projects in the last several months, this was updated just this month, that 862 initiated projects, 800 remain active. This shows by area, antivirals, treatments, and vaccines. You'll see that there are 200 vaccines in development, by the way, not just the 4 or 5 that you always read about. So that will allow for a very robust response as we go forward, as some of these other vaccines and plenty of competition in the marketplace. You can see that some of those projects have already failed, though, because the science is by no means a certain thing. Okay, that's just detail on the types of products. Again, over 3/4 are small companies, about a little less than 10% are not-for-profit institutions, and then the large companies, about 15% of the research and development of COVID drugs. The final slide, I think, is the one, also to leave you all with. The response to developing COVID treatments, vaccines, antivirals has been truly global. Yes, the US accounts for about half, and we're proud of that in the US, and we're proud that our ecosystem here in the US of small companies rose to the occasion, even before public money or guaranteed financing was available, just in, like I said, a 4-month period. But you're also seeing all these other countries stepping up and contributing projects. And of course, that's necessary because we don't know which ones are going to be successful. We're going to need global supply for all of these, and we need this diversity. If this had been 20 or 30 years ago, and there had only been 15, the industry and research and development had been dominated by 15 or 20 large companies, this would not have been possible. The response would have been much slower, it would have been much less robust. much more concentrated in the US, frankly, and much less able to respond to the crisis. So I think those of us who've been involved in TRIPS and who have been part of it since the beginning can be proud of what we've done here, of what this has been able to engender. And we should not take this for granted, as I've said. It was by no means clear that something like this would have existed in 2020 when this pandemic struck. I'll just leave you with one final note, because I think the next thing, I mean, hopefully this pandemic, that the world deals with this pandemic in this year of 2021 and begins to get it under control. But there's already a similar, what I've not had time to focus on, we can do in a future presentation, if desired, is the fact that there is a similar ecosystem being created to deal with climate and environmental change using biotechnology. And that is also truly global. And that has also been truly spurred by the developments and by the infrastructure and the system created by the TRIPS agreement. So there are clear linkages, that and clear evidence that TRIPS is contributing not just to the current crisis we face, but to the other big crisis that the world faces, which is climate and environmental change. And I believe, and that sector is a little bit slower, it's a little bit newer, not slower, it's just newer, there's fewer, it's smaller, but it's growing more rapidly. And I think you're going to see similar responses in the next 5 to 10 years to global climate change. You're going to see amazing technological developments, and you're going to see them all over the world. So I'll stop there, and I thank everybody. I thank the WTO again for inviting me. Look forward to listening to the other speakers.
Thank you very much indeed, Joe. Very much appreciated. You've covered a lot of ground in short space of time and brought us up to very much to the present day and the current challenges. Indeed, it would be great in the future to explore the environmental dimension and the climate dimension. But thank you so much for covering all of that in this short space of time. We now shift to the field of agriculture, agricultural innovation, and it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Dominic Mildemans, who is, in fact, you'll see from the CV, an independent legal practitioner, but one who has been advising industry and working with a range of different international processes and advising and discussing this area, in particular, in this case, the intellectual property system and crop protection, and the development of new plant varieties with a view to supporting and advancing sustainable agriculture. So, Dominic, with thanks, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Tony, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you. And thanks again for this opportunity to talk about the role of IP to support sustainable agriculture, which is actually a really good topic, I think, looking at the role that TRIPS has played into securing IP, actually, as we will see through the presentation. And that's actually what I would like to focus on today, is to use some of the key principles and key guiding articles that have been included in TRIPS and the relevance for the different elements when we talk about innovation in agriculture. Because if we talk about agricultural innovations, we are really talking about how can we deal and manage the huge societal needs that we are actually facing. I mean, Joe already talked about the issues we face on climate change, issues we face on human health, and of course there is also the very important issue of the effect of food security and the strong and stable food supply that needs to be maintained. But this needs to be put in balance, in a balancing act, whereby we safeguard this agriculture productivity, but at the same time we have these environmental and societal changes that we need to manage, and that we need to manage sustainably. This can only be done if we have innovation, and hence the whole agricultural sector comes into play to provide these innovations. It's very important to remind us of the fact that innovation in agriculture is extremely resource intensive. it's resource intensive with regard to the cost. The top 10 companies invest $2.25 billion US a year. And there is a huge ecosystem of innovation, again, referring a bit to Joe's presentation that he showed as bio members, for instance, and he focused on healthcare, biotech, but there is a very similar ecosystem also with academia and smaller companies, in addition to the big companies who are the members of CropLife, who are investing a lot in agriculture. And then there is not only the cost element, but there's also the time element. It takes a huge amount of time actually to develop these ag innovations, whether it's a GMO trait, whether it's a variety, or whether it is, for instance, a new crop protection product. We're looking at time frames who are beyond 10 years actually. And then what is very important if we talk about ag innovations is to keep in mind that innovation in agriculture comes in different forms. Some people would say, I'm focusing quite a bit on GMO traits, and that's the key point of innovation or the key point then of IP that we're looking at. Others would focus on plant varieties, the new varieties, bred, the plant breeding, with a lot of very interesting developments there. Then you have the additional element of inputs in agriculture, which are the crop protection products, which also come in different forms, with huge changes that we are seeing now as well with chemical crop protection products, biological crop protection products, the biocontrol. And we also see the huge impact of digitization. We're going to see digitization in every sector, in every application in our life, but we are definitely going to see it in agriculture as well, with the existence of digital agriculture, smart agriculture, where we will see a whole new ecosystem that comes into existence, which will also be important then to be sustained if we want to keep this innovation. So that's very important to keep that in mind, that in agriculture, we're talking about different elements actually that are part of this innovation toolbox, so to speak, and that we all need, and that are also then all requiring different types of IP rights. Because if we then look, of course, in the context of the discussion we have today, and in the context also of looking at TRIPS, what is then the importance of IP rights in the context of agricultural innovations, and what kind of form do these IP rights have? It's of key importance that you have IP, you have effective IP, because then you have a reasonable break-even point. And we'll come back to the economic underpinning of what is this reasonable break-even point, but it's actually this element of you need to have an incentive today to actually push you in investing the time and the resources in potentially developing an innovation. And as we've seen again in the slide of Joe, also in agriculture, a huge percentage of the things you will invest in will fail. And so there's actually the need for legal certainty, reasonable break-even point to provide that incentive. But what is very important is that we are not only talking about the value creation and enabling actually the creation of this innovation for the entity that will invest the time and the money, but it's also to ensure that IP enables this innovation to be actually shared further down the value chain. And it enables also that the sharing happens with high quality products. We'll see in an example that we will discuss later how this is done, for instance, through non-exclusive licensing. But it's actually very important to keep in mind that IP is not only there to enable a reasonable return on investment, but it's also there to actually enable a very effective division of benefits further down the chain with and through high quality products. Again, as we've said, ag innovations come in different forms. So they require different forms of IP. They actually require a toolbox of different IP sets, including the following. First of all, you need effective plant breeders' rights. If you want to protect a plant variety, then a plant breeders' rights or a PVP right is key. If you talk about traits, then you need effective patent rights. You also have the additional complexity now, and Tony referred to that in his introduction, of access and benefit sharing, access to germplasm, access to genetic resources, and Pierre will talk about that as well. We have the additional importance of protecting the regulatory data, which is another field in which there is a lot of investment done because the products that we are looking at are highly regulated. And then if we talk about digital agriculture, there is the need to look at frameworks for the access to an exchange of data, and the protection of data, which I think for all IP practitioners is a very interesting field to follow very closely as well, where we will be all be talking about quite a bit in the future. So in that sense, it's very important to focus on the balanced IP system, the all-encompassing IP system, to make sure that we actually have a high probability and high availability of these ag innovations. And as indicated, this has two legs. It has a leg on value creation, and it has a leg on value sharing. Now, if we look at the principles and key articles that TRIPS provided with regard to agriculture or applicable to agriculture, I think TRIPS has really been very important and continues to be very important in setting and providing the guidance on some of these key IP principles which are relevant for agriculture. First of all, with regard to patents, TRIPS makes it clear that patents need to be available in all fields of technology if, of course, they comply with the patentability criteria. So they actually want to safeguard high quality patents in every field of technology. We know that in agriculture, there has been quite a lot of discussions on to what extent can you patent life, where are the limitations to biological inventions. That in itself is a conference, but it's important to go always back to these key principles that are there in Article 27.1 of TRIPS. In addition, what TRIPS has also done is that they recognized the actually complexity of ag innovations in the sense that we are not only talking about things which are protectable by patents, but there are other types of inventions like we've seen the plant varieties, where also TRIPS has provided very clear guidance by indicating that there should be effective protection for plant varieties, either by patents or by an effective sui generis system. And we'll come back to that in a minute, which is also continuing to set the scene in providing an effective international protection for plant breeders' rights. And TRIPS looks at balancing, providing for a balanced IP protection, which might include limitations and exceptions, but they also set guidance for what kind of limitations or what kind of exceptions can actually be imposed. They should be limited, they should not unreasonably conflict with the normal exploitation of the patent, and they should not unreasonably prejudice the legitimate interests of the owner. And things like this are very important when you discuss limitations, when you discuss exemptions. For instance, exemptions with regard to breeders' rights and things like that related to patents. When we now look at these three different fields actually in agriculture, first patents, then plant variety protection rights, and then also the protection of regulatory data, why do we need patents? As already pointed out, plant innovations consist of varieties and traits. A patent is required because a trait which can actually be used in different plant varieties cannot be protected by a plant variety protection right. So in that sense, we see that modern plant breeding depends on biotechnology to develop more effective and environmentally friendly varieties, and these traits can be introgressed in different varieties. Hence, there is the need for effective patent protection above and beyond plant variety protection rights. What should be avoided is that you have a scope of a patent protection which is so limited that it actually undermines this reasonable break-even point that we talked about, because that would push things in the context of trade secret protection. And as we will refer to later in our example of oilseed rape, that actually in that specific case has led to a failure, while the patented technology actually led to societal benefits. Always coming back to the fact that you need effective patent protection, but you need a balanced patent system. And this is very important. It is also very important and is stressed by the users of patents and by the patent owners. What is a key element for a balanced patent system is the quality of your patents. Only inventions that are really qualifying with these patentability criteria should be patented. Very important. Secondly, there are important initiatives to secure transparency. Transparency is important, for instance, with regard to giving visibility to patents to breeders. There's a database called Pinto, set up by the European Seed Association, Euroseeds. There is a discussion on licensing, again, a conference in itself, how to make sure that bilateral and potentially multilateral licensing happens in an effective way, but this has also been taken up by the sector, for instance, in the vegetable licensing platform. And then we talked about exemptions. There's discussions on how can you define a breeder's exemption, for instance, to ensure the breeder's freedom to operate with regard to patents. So again, if we have a balanced patent system, we enable both the value creation and the value sharing. Let's go now to the plant variety protection rights, which is another very important piece of IP for ag innovations. As we have seen, TRIPS clearly recognized the importance of protection for varieties and indicated that this can be done either by patents or by a sui generis system. There's a few countries who opted for patent rights. Most countries opt for a system which is a different right, and most of these countries will opt for a system that actually fits within UPOV. So in that sense, what we see here is that TRIPS setting out guidance also relies on other type of international organizations, UPOV also being based in Geneva, who sets and provides for a very well-defined framework, which enables actually countries to then comply with their obligations in TRIPS. It's interesting, I think, to refer to some studies that have come out that indicate actually how important PVP rights are for countries. So we talk about the role of IP for sustainable agriculture, and there are two interesting examples. One is Kenya, that has PVP protection since 1997. And there we have seen that in with regard to maize, which is a clear staple food for Kenya, we have seen an increase in the number of varieties from 70 to 60. And we've seen that these new varieties provide a much higher yield, a higher tolerance to pests and diseases, and have actually created a huge improvement in the sustainability of the agriculture in Kenya. And we see that in 2016, they had 1,500 protected plant varieties. A similar economic study in Vietnam has shown that there was a 20% increase in productivity after the UPOV membership, which is more recent, and their PVP framework is actually more recent than Kenya. This is important. This is important to look at, and it's important for people who deal with TRIPS to make the more abstract principles in TRIPS concrete as to the benefits that these key IP frameworks provide for countries, in this case like Kenya and Vietnam. Again, PVP rights, value creation, but it's a balancing act. There is value sharing that needs to happen, so it's always required to have a balanced system, including a balanced PVP system. Some of the things which are relevant there, and they go a bit beyond, I think, the scope of this seminar, but they're important in the context of UPOV, is the discussion on how do we define the concept of essentially derived varieties, taking into consideration new developments like new breeding techniques. How do we ensure legal certainty around issues like harvested material? And important because we talked about exemptions earlier. For instance, how can specific exemptions be endorsed? How can they be well defined? And one of these developments that are fairly recent is the support that is provided for private and non-commercial use exemptions for small-scale farmers. Again, talking about the balancing act in sustainable agriculture. And it's important that this is all done in a dialogue with all stakeholders in the PVP policy. The next few slides actually indicate, and now I'm going from the development on the plant to the development in the crop protection product. These few slides indicate that also in the development of crop protection products, you see actually a huge increase in costs, and the total cost that is needed to develop and get regulatory approval for a crop protection product is actually going towards 300 and sometimes even over $300 for one product. So also in crop protection, it's important to keep in mind that there we have an IP toolbox that is actually important. Of course, patents on active ingredients. One that I will focus on is the CBI component, the exclusive use rights in safety data, because that's very much related also to an important TRIPS provision. And then copyright protection and also trademark protection. This gives just an explanation, I think, of some of these different elements, but I will not talk about those too much because we still need some time for the economic study as well. Again, using the hook of TRIPS, we have the Article 39.2 providing for the protection of confidential business information, which is of course very important. But we also, specifically for the pharmaceutical and agricultural chemical sector, we have this Article 39.3, which actually provides for protection against unfair commercial use of regulatory data. And this actually provides the international legal basis for countries to provide for, and actually an obligation to provide for, effective exclusive use rights. This is also mimicked in the annex to the SPS agreement and is a very important part of the regulatory process of agricultural products, and is to a certain extent a bit undermined by certain developments that we see in the world with regard to very far-reaching transparency rules on access to regulatory data, including often the confidential business information. This slide actually shows the continuous and sustainable product of life, the life cycle, with the patents, with the new product discovery, the protection of regulatory data at registration. But then, of course, when the IP is expired, it feeds the generic industry. It enables that the generics provide for more competition, and that in itself will spur actually new innovation and the new development of patents. One final slide for this part on counterfeits. Very important issue in agriculture is the occurrence of illegal crop protection products, counterfeit products, and illegal seed practices. And it's important to look at that as well in the context of TRIPS, because TRIPS also imposes countries to actually look for effective enforcement rules in this regard. And when you look at sustainable agriculture, counterfeit seeds and counterfeit crop protection products really create a lot of harm, destroy a lot of value in this context. And Tony, I think I'll need to fairly wrap up the presentation, not to eat up the time of other people. What I will quickly do is also introduce a study that we have done on the economics of IP. And I do understand that the slides will be made available, and actually people can then look into the detail of the study, and the study itself can also be made available, because we talk about the role of IP in sustainable agriculture. What we have done is we looked at certain public data that could actually underpin the model that shows that you need a reasonable break-even point for IP, but that actually shows that the multitude of benefits that go to the developer actually go to society. So the key model that was developed there establishes a link between IP and the costs and the benefits, but shows that a multitude of the benefits accrue downstream. And we have done that by looking at a case in France on oilseed rape, where biotechnology was developed by a public institution called INRA, non-exclusively licensed to seed companies with a quick uptake by farmers. But what we've seen there is that 75 to 80% of the value that was actually generated through effective IP was being shared and was being actually flowing further downstream to farmers and consumers. And I think it's very interesting to look at that, to say that if you have very strong principles on IP, like you have in TRIPS, which are then further implemented in regional national IP frameworks, that this actually provides not only for an effective value creation, but it enables also the sharing of these benefits to society as a whole, and in our world, of course, a lot to the farmers downstream. So I'll stop there, Tony, and I will leave the other details and the graphs in this presentation for people who want to look at it in the presentation if it's shared. And again, as said, if there's an interest, also the study can be provided and further discussed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Dominic, again for covering a lot of territory in a short space of time. As we've both commented, I think the issues you've touched on are themselves the subject not only of a seminar but of a conference, and indeed have been. And so we're simply grateful that you can lay out that perspective as a reminder of the significance and the range of these issues. I'd like to just, as we move along, I'd like to remind all participants we're fielding your questions so that the final session will be a more interactive chance to respond to your questions and comments. We're going to try and cluster them in specific themes and then put them to our panelists so that you can get the feedback to the questions, the issues you raise. I've mentioned the significance of biodiversity and the Convention on Biological Diversity, and I'm truly delighted that we've been able to get the acceptance of our invitation from Pierre Duplessis, who is a leading international expert in this field, representing both his country of origin, as it were, Namibia, but also the African Union, and is, of course, very well known and respected in circles dealing with biodiversity, and in particular, the question we've touched on of access and benefit sharing. And we're really delighted he's able to join us today. He'll give us a bit more background, I think, on the legal instruments I've mentioned. But as you can see from the slide, he will focus on the question long discussed in this area of disclosure of origin in applications for IP protection, concerning the use of genetic resources in the innovation process, and of the use of associated traditional knowledge. Thank you very much, Pierre. I'm delighted to pass the floor across to you.
Thank you, Tony. Hello, everyone. Yes, when I was asked to talk about this, I thought, really one of the big things that we need to address, and which, by my understanding, the TRIPS agreement was supposed to address, is this idea that legal certainty is a very important part of investment in the development of biodiversity products, be they in pharma, be they in agriculture, be they in industrial biotech. And when I started working in this area, one of the things that struck me was that how many people in developing countries were very, very distrustful of intellectual property on biological diversity, and were particularly distrustful of the TRIPS agreement. In fact, the TRIPS agreement served as an impetus for a big pushback in developing countries against access to genetic resources and so on. And since we're taking a historical perspective here of 25 years, I thought it might be interesting to go back a little bit further than that, and to look at the role that genetic resources and international trade in genetic resources has played in shaping biodiversity as it is today. And of course, there's the background kind of like basic human activity of being hunter-gatherers, really knowing your local environment incredibly well, having very few, if any, domesticated species. And in fact, today, these are still some of the only truly sustainable societies that we know, some of them having been around and stable for 50,000 years or more. And then there's the well-known development of agriculture 10,000 years ago, and the domestication of crops, the domestication of livestock, the spread of those by Neolithic human migration, domestication process that happens in many different places all around the world. Eventually, this leads to settled human societies, civilizations, which this means that they basically started building cities. And then those cities, of course, later, some of them evolve into empires. And those empires then go around and they spread crops, and they also bring them back to other areas. And there's this mixing going on. And then in the 15th century, when Columbus went to America, to the New World, there's this huge big Columbian exchange that happens of crops that get introduced into the Americas, and crops from the Americas that then get taken to the rest of the world and spread throughout the rest of the world, and kind of basically transform not only food production and the relationship between people and biodiversity, but also lay the basis for what would eventually become industrialized society as we know it today. And it's quite interesting when you look at this exchange of genetic resources, so to speak, that they not only included what we today see as important cash crops, but they also included pathogens. So, for example, smallpox went to North America and wiped out a whole lot of the Native American population. Malaria and yellow fever went over and became endemic in places and made them, changed population dynamics. The plague came into Africa and Europe from the east. And there's all these movements going around. And I've added a few here that have been particularly important as industrial crops. Rubber that went from South America to East Asia, and oil palm that went from Africa to Southeast Asia. Quinine, which opened up, by allowing people to farm in areas where before malaria had kept populations low, allowed population growth and the expansion of agriculture into areas of biodiversity where it had not really been possible before. And then, of course, the soybean that came from the east and mainly went to South America. Well, it went all over the world. But, the biodiversity impact of this exchange and of this movement of crops around the world has been truly devastating, right? What you're looking at here is what used to be very biodiversity-rich rainforest in Borneo is today a monoculture of oil palm with nothing growing in it. And I'm sure you're very familiar with the contrast between the original forests in South America. I believe this is Brazil, but it might be Argentina. And and the huge scale of that farming. This looks like the invasion of the body snatchers a bit, doesn't it? Right? And a lot of that farming happening because it's the products from that's used to feed animals at an industrial scale of unimaginable scale. Huge farming operations, and of course that's very closely tied up with the rise in human population. Our ability to feed 7.5 billion people, and hopefully we'll be able to keep up when we hit 9 billion or 9.5 billion. And I think it's also important if you're trying to understand the sentiments and the feelings that are out there in developing countries around genetic resources, access to those genetic resources and use of those resources and intellectual property over those resources, that you remember that this particular exchange was not a peaceful exercise in multilateralism, right? This was not the multilateral system of the international treaty. This was accompanied by horrific crimes against people, genocide at an unimaginable scale, by maybe the biggest disaster ever to befall anyone, which is slavery in Africa. And and also all the disruptions that it brought about within the local societies, right? If you look at this photograph, you'll see that the slaver is also in fact an African. So it also disrupted the relationship that people had with nature and with biodiversity and with the land in a very fundamental way. There was huge social upheaval. This is a photograph of Native American children in the United States, but similar exercises to remove children from their traditional cultures happened all over the place where colonialism took root. And those things are remembered today. They're part of people's mythologies. They shape people's worldviews. They have not been forgotten. I mean, somebody once said to me, Europeans got over colonialism really easily, and they can't understand why the rest of the world won't follow suit. Well, the rest of the world felt it in a very different way. And then this is an interesting development of the triangular trade in the North Atlantic, which you might have heard of, where textiles, rum, and manufactured goods were taken from Europe to Africa, then exchanged for slaves, which were taken to the Americas, and sugar, tobacco, and cotton were taken back to provide raw materials for the emerging industries in North. Of course, this development didn't only affect people in developing countries, right? One of the reasons they took tobacco was because it was used to keep the child labor in the factories happier than they would have been without tobacco. And as a smoker, I can tell you that's a lot happier than you are without. This whole industrialization led to some terrible human rights abuses, child labor. This is a photograph of children who've lost limbs working in factories. And it also led to geopolitical shenanigans of an intensity that seems almost unimaginable today. For example, the Berlin Conference, where Africa was divided up between the European powers, right? And then I found this little map. It shows basically the only part of the world that was not colonized by Europe was Antarctica. And to a certain extent, China and the Arabian Peninsula and Turkey were simply spheres of influence. And if you think this is an ancient concern, all right, here's a screenshot from The Guardian yesterday's The Guardian, where the president of Ireland actually speaks out quite strongly against this feigned amnesia about British imperialism. And he, of course, being Irish, he would have felt British imperialism most keenly. But there are many other people around the world who remember other forms of imperialism just as keenly. I mean, earlier this week, for example, there was a story about how France is now finally engaging Algeria in a discussion about the atrocities that happened there during the colonial period. And the reason that this is important is because when the plantation agriculture later turned into this industrial production system, industrial capital as we know it, and the geopolitical contest that set off between the great powers, the scramble for Africa, the economic nationalism, the trade blocs and spheres of influence, which then led to two terrible world wars. That was kind of the point where the world went, okay, that's maybe not the best way of doing things. And it laid the foundation for what we today understand as the international rules-based order, which of course, although the International Trade Organization was not officially agreed at Bretton Woods, was then agreed in 95 in the Uruguay round. Right. And so you have this after the Second World War, the Bretton Woods conference, the formation of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then as a result of that, you have an international movement of independence and anti-colonialism and sovereignty. And there's armed struggles, there's the formation of the non-aligned movement, the G77, all of this happening against the background of the Cold War. And at that time, the guiding principles of this decolonization exercise were concepts like the new international economic order and permanent sovereignty over natural resources for newly independent countries. And in 1986, the UN Declaration on the right to development. Now, there's a case to be made for review that, in fact, the international rules-based order didn't, in fact, really change all that much in the power balances and in the justice that prevails in the relationships between nations. All right, that IMF and colonialism is essentially the same impulse, just dressed in different suits. Okay, so I mean, in parallel with this, there's a rising concern about the impact that humans are having on nature. All right, so you find in the late 18th century the first legally protected areas being put in place. Now, first national park in 1870, and then the Organization for the Protection of Nature in 1928, and the IUCN in 1948, at the same time as the Declaration of Human Rights. At the same time, you have this evolution of genetic science, and you have what I always think of as a critical moment, the publication of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson in 1962, which then really it inserts environmental concerns more widely into public consciousness, resulting in 1972 in the Stockholm Conference on Human Environment, where for the first time there's then a discussion internationally around a program to conserve the world's genetic resources. In 1980, this is followed up by the American Council's report to the US president. There's the World Conservation Strategy in 1980, which basically comes up with the architecture that links conservation with sustainable use of genetic resources as a form of nature protection, which then later gets encoded into the CBD. Then there's a Brundtland report in 87, and then there's the negotiation of the CBD starting in 88. And it takes a long time to negotiate the CBD. There's this whole range of meetings. And then the CBD brings in this innovation where it says access to genetic resources would be allowed by countries who have sovereign rights over those genetic resources, but in exchange for fair and equitable sharing of the benefits, which has been called this grand global bargain on how to go about protecting not only genetic resources, but protecting biodiversity more generally. And the CBD confirms that sustainable use of genetic resources is a key for sustainable socioeconomic development. But at the same time, when the CBD has adopted, the Cold War ends, the Soviet Union falls apart. Francis Fukuyama writes the end of history, and capitalism rampant basically takes over without real opposition in many parts of the world. And then shortly after that, the WTO is formed and the TRIPS agreement enters into force. Right? And so by many people in developing countries, the TRIPS agreement was seen as a final push to subordinate all of life to the interests of Western capital, all life everywhere. Right? I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that that was the perception, and that to a very large extent has shaped how people have seen not only access to genetic resources, but in a more particular way, the issuing of intellectual property rights over those genetic resources. And unfortunately, I mean, I have here two infographics that were done by Rachel Weinberg and Sarah Laird to show, how things have changed internationally. And I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go through them in detail. But basically, this second one is particularly interesting because it shows you that as the world continues to talk about this, the world's biodiversity continues to decline. And in 2019, we have the IPBES report that shows, that everywhere biodiversity is in really dire straits, right? And that there are indirect social drivers of this, and there are also direct drivers such as land and sea use change and direct exploitation of biodiversity and climate change and pollution and invasive alien species. But the social values behind this, in which includes the international economic order, have certainly contributed to driving these direct drivers. And then I think people are very often, we get very stuck on benefit sharing or like access, and we forget that the objective was always to make access and benefit sharing into a sustainable development pathway, to set up ways for developing countries to develop economically without the need to destroy biodiversity. But it clearly hasn't worked. Right? And it's been acknowledged that it hasn't worked. I mean, we had a report last year about how spectacularly we failed to meet the 2020 biodiversity targets. And we've been negotiating a post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And I would say if you look at the time frames that scientists tell us we have left to do something, this might very well be our last chance to fix things. So clearly, the neoliberalism hasn't done it. I mean, this is acknowledged now even by business. There's a business alliance that came up with this "No profits on a dead planet" slogan. Although multilateralism has been weakened when we need it most, I mean, we still have multilateral institutions in place. And the language around the post-2020 framework and also the Sustainable Development Goals is encouraging. There's talk about the future we want, transformative change, leaving no one behind, building back better, and coming up with a new deal for people and nature. But it would require an enormous effort, probably at a scale not seen since World War II. And there are lately in the last few months, like some very promising developments, including the Dasgupta review, which came out, I think, about a week ago now. So the world is clearly at a turning point, and that brings me back almost at the end of my time to the title of my talk, Legal Certainty for All. How disclosure of origin, which has been a contentious issue in TRIPS, but also at the WIPO Intergovernmental Committee on Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge and Folklore, was intended to assure countries of origin that their right to benefit sharing will be protected when intellectual property is issued over innovations that are made with resources that they have provided access to. But as I recently argued in a panel discussion at WIPO, basically that reason to demand disclosure of origin is gone. We've lost that opportunity. That's not going to work. The time frame, the urgency of the situation doesn't allow us to do that anymore. So in a way, the point is mute. I mean, maybe now in the WIPO, it looks like they will actually agree on a disclosure of origin in patent applications, maybe when they can meet again. But I would say maybe it's time to try something new. And the new thing that we can try is to simply charge benefits on all the products that are produced from biological resources. A penny on the dollar with 1% charge, and pay that over into a global fund that will support indigenous people in local communities to look after biodiversity. That will actually change the economics of the situation from one where it pays you more to destroy biodiversity to one where it actually is viable to maintain that biodiversity. So we'll directly pay IPLCs who occupy 6% of the land, but look after 80% of the biodiversity to look after it, all right? I mean, the estimated need was about $1 trillion a year. That's what we need to save biodiversity. And just to put it into perspective, you know, the harmful subsidies in agriculture worth something between $4 and $6 trillion a year, according to Das Gupta. And COVID is estimated to have cost the world economy at least 10 trillion. Right? So, I mean, we're not actually talking about that much money, although $1 trillion sounds like a lot to me. And then, of course, we'll have the added bonus that all the people who've been wasting their time trying to implement ABS systems that don't save biodiversity will then be able to do something useful. And if you were to make this fundamental change in approach, then the only thing that you would need to disclose in an IP application is that you use biology. So it wouldn't matter where you got the biology, and it wouldn't matter like what tools you apply to it. Did you apply digital tools or old-fashioned ones? Did you just breed it, or did you actually genetically engineer it? Wouldn't really matter, because the only thing in the end that would be important is that you're selling a product based on biodiversity. And I found this beautiful quote, and also in the Das Gupta report: to detach nature from economic reasoning is to imply that we consider ourselves to be external to nature. The fault is not in the economics, and the fault is also not in the intellectual property system. It lies in the way we have chosen to practice it. Transformative change is possible, and we and our descendants deserve nothing less. And if we can maybe all rally around that in our hour of need, then, you know, we will manage to pull through on our lonely little planet out there in the dark cold. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Pierre. That remarkable historical perspective certainly eclipses our parochial 25-year perspective, and you've brought us up to date and gave us a hopeful glimpse of the future as well. And I know already that we're fielding a number of questions that will feed into or respond to that presentation. So thank you very much. But yes, indeed, time is marching on. So I would now like to introduce the next speaker. John Liddicoat is a Senior Research Associate at the Faculty of Law of the University of Cambridge. One of the questions we've fielded actually talks about empirical data, and perhaps the need to build the background of empirical data when we talk about patents, innovation, biotech. And that, of course, is something that John is quite renowned for in his work, linking empirical work with legal research. So John, with great pleasure, I now pass the floor to you.
Thanks for that introduction, Tony. I'm very pleased to be here. Okay, just get my slides up. Okay, so let me begin by saying that these webinars are wonderful events. Today I want to talk about the world's understandings and laws about gene patents and how they've changed over the lifetime of TRIPS, and how I think this can be reflected in Article 27, which focuses on patentable subject matter,
especially through the ongoing review of Article 27.3b. So today's plan, I'll begin with some scene setting, talking about Article 27, 3b and its ongoing review, and then a few words about gene patents. I'll then move into the substance of the talk, which is a brief history of TRIPS and gene patents, particularly in biotech powerhouses. And there I'll look at a convergence in patenting practice between 1980 and 2010, and then a divergence between 2010 and now. I'll then finish off this section by looking at a review of empirical studies that colleagues and I have conducted over the years. I'll then finish with a reflection on what the evidence and divergence means for the review of Article 27.3b, and then finish with a modest suggestion. So to gene patents, I'll be talking about gene patents today. And when I say that, I mean isolated and purified DNA with a counterpart in nature. And I'll focus on what these mean for innovation. I won't talk about relationships or correlations between certain DNA sequences and characteristics, nor will I talk about moral and ethical views. That's not because these aren't unimportant. I think they're desperately important, but I've only been given 20 minutes. I'll also focus on gene patents in human medicine. Much of this overlaps with patents on plants and animals, etc., but they raise separate issues. I'll also talk about Article 27.3b in detail, but to the exclusion of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Our research wasn't really orientated towards the CBD. However, there are obvious implications and perhaps some counterintuitive implications. And so I'd be happy to discuss those later. The next part of this scene setting is Article 27 itself. And I'll briefly run through this, even though it's already been touched on. So subsection 1 says that patents should be available for any inventions in all fields of technology, provided they meet the tests of patentability. Subsection 2 is where we find the ordre public and morality exclusions. And then subsection 3, where I want to focus, begins, members may also exclude from patentability. And this is where we find the exclusions for diagnostics and therapeutics, etc. I'm more interested in subsection B. So this continues, members may also exclude patentability, plants and animals and other microorganisms and essentially biological processes. Then at the second dot point, as has been discussed, members shall provide for the protection of plant varieties either through patents or effective sui generis system. But then the third dot point is where I'm really interested, is the provision of this subparagraph shall be reviewed 4 years after the date of entry into the force of the WTO agreement. Now you might be wondering, where do gene patents come into that? And that's where the review comes in. So the review of Article 27.3 commenced in 1999. Largely on time, but has stalled since 2006. The latest review of discussions lists 4 reform options. The first is to amend the article to prohibit patents on all living organisms and their parts, including genes, as well as natural processes. I should stress here that this isn't an optional exclusion anymore. This would be mandatory. The second option is to repeal the article, so make no mention of optional exclusions for plants, effectively the opposite of the first reform option. The third option is to retain the article without amendment. So this would maintain the status quo. And then the fourth option is to retain the article and provide clarifications and definitions. I'll say a little bit more about these options at the end of my talk, and I'll just leave them there for now. Right now, I'd like to move into this brief history of TRIPS and gene patents. And so the convergence between 1980 and 2010. I think this starts in 1981. Braithwaite and Drahaus record that the first embryonic thinking for a specific TRIPS-like agreement began in US business people's minds in this year. And then Greeley and Sherko record that the first gene patent was actually granted in 1981 as well, being granted in the US, Italy, Great Britain, and Japan. In 1986, we see the Uruguay round being the genesis for TRIPS. And then in 1990, the Human Genome Project begins. In 1995, TRIPS becomes effective. I need not say any more to this audience about that. But then in 1998, we see 2 things. The first one being the European Biotech Directive comes into force, specifically stating that gene patents are patent eligible subject matter. This was then incorporated into the European Patent Convention, which means it now applies to 38 member states, including Britain, despite Brexit. The Biotech Directive took over 10 years to negotiate, and one of the driving forces of it were to harmonize the law on key aspects and create a competitive patenting environment to rival the US and Japan. The second event in 1998 was that patents on BRCA genes started to be granted. These patents were for isolated genes related to breast and ovarian cancer. These patents were widely granted around the world, demonstrating patent offices' practices. This included across Europe, Germany, Britain, France, also Japan, Canada, and Australia. This didn't include more modern biotech powerhouses such as the Republic of Korea and China. However, this became clear that they did grant gene patents over the coming years. In 1999, then the review of Article 27.3 began. And in 2003, the Human Genome Project completed. And then in 2006, the last substantive progress on the review of Article 27.3b, as I've already touched on. Now, that was a lot of information, so let me try and summarize. I think the orthodox approach to patenting isolated DNA during this time is best captured by Philip Grubb in the 2004 version of his Handbook of Global Patent Issues for Practitioners. He commented, isolation or purification makes DNA patentable, and if it wasn't, this would have devastating consequences for the biotech industry. He also said any challenges to claims on isolated DNA would likely fail. I guess this just goes to show that books don't always tell the truth. I shall also note that some countries during this time, such as Brazil and India, didn't grant gene patents. However, I want to concentrate on the so-called biotech powerhouses, but that's probably a good segue to start talking about the divergence. So this begins in 2010 when we had the first court decision on the BRCA genes in Association for Molecular Pathology in the USPTO. Myriad Genetics, who was the exclusive licensee of the patents, was one of the other named parties to this decision. One of the issues motivating this litigation was that research in the United States had shown over 50% of labs had at one stage decided not to develop or perform a diagnostic test due to a patent. A US district court at first instance hearing found that the claims to BRCA genes did not constitute patentable subject matter and invalidly granted. I won't say more about that reasoning, I'll leave it for later on. I think it's important to note at this stage, a small revolution in patentable subject matter was taking place in the US. Myriad and several other cases, one I've highlighted here being Mayo and Prometheus, changed the US Patent Office's practice on other aspects of patentable subject matter law. I won't go into the detail of these decisions as they're beyond the scope of this talk, but they're important to note as I'll mention Mayo again. In 2013, we then received, or the US Supreme Court decided AMP and Myriad, which was the continuation of the 2010 District Court decision. In this case, the US Supreme Court said that laws of nature are not patentable, and one of the reasons for that was that they might inhibit future innovation. However, they said that compounds derived from nature can be made patentable if they are markedly different, if they are made markedly different. However, they said that merely isolating genes didn't make them markedly different, and therefore they held that isolated DNA, or to the BRCA genes, was invalidly granted, but cDNA, which is made by a very specific laboratory technique, was valid, even though the sequence of DNA bases was exactly the same as that exists in nature. In 2015, the Australian High Court, the Apex Court in Australia, decided Darcy and Myriad, which concerned the Australian equivalent patents of those litigated in the United States. In this decision, the majority said that there are chemical, structural, and functional differences between isolated DNA and DNA that exists in nature. But they also said that the claims themselves were directed to information, which was discerned, not made. They therefore said that both isolated DNA and cDNA were invalidly granted. However, not all Apex Court decisions on gene patents during this time invalidated the claims. In Germany, the Bundesgerichtshof in receptor tyrosine kinase held that isolated DNA to the FLT3 gene, FLT3, was validly granted because it was created by a technical process, and this was consistent with the EU Biotech Directive. As of 2020, various law reform bills have been presented in the States, but there's no change on the horizon, or not immediately. Interestingly, no bills have been put forward in Australia to change the law there. So now I'd like to look to a review of evidence that's been conducted by colleagues and I over the years. And the first question we were interested in was how many patents to isolated DNA were granted each year in the United States. And to begin with, you can see here that just towards the end of the Human Genome Project, quite a few patents were being granted. But in the final few years of the Human Genome Project and in the years after, it's dropped. And you might say that perhaps it's stabilized a little, but actually in the years afterwards, it's continued to drop. And these numbers, we should note, are actually lower than after individual interpretation, because in the United States, everything after the decision in 2013 to isolated DNA as it exists in nature would be invalid. I should also point out that this reduction has continued. We have unpublished data on that. And then I also note that the small applicants, here represented in blue, have effectively disappeared since the decision. In related research, we also looked at whether gene patents block tests elsewhere in the world, as this was one of the critical issues in the States. And in a series of papers, we've concluded that generally no, this is or was a distinctly North American issue. The next question we were interested in was how to redraft a gene patent claim to make it patentable, because this effectively shows us the boundary of the law. And to do this, we identified all the relevant isolated DNA patents that were applied for before the decision in the US and then tracked them through prosecution. We only found 21 that received a myriad rejection after the decision and then was amended to become eligible. Here are how the patents were amended to become eligible. Some of these are relatively trivial, such as adding a label or inserting into a vector, which are very relatively ancient techniques, or at least for biotechnology. We concluded here that many of these claims lay close to the boundary, and I suspect quite a few, or the majority of the are correctly granted. However, we also thought that it might still be possible to obtain similar breadth of claims to isolated gene patents by sort of patching together these different claims. The next question we were interested in was whether myriad applies to subject matter beyond isolated DNA. And to do this, we looked at, in 2018, we looked at the 200 most recently granted patents that during prosecution, the examiner issued a rejection based on myriad, applying the reasoning in myriad. And of these 200, we found that 170, or 85% of the time the rejection was issued, it was to subject matter beyond isolated DNA. So in the US, this included things such as peptides, proteins, antibodies, cells, and pharmaceutical compositions. What does this mean for innovation? Well, we're not actually sure. But if we contrast this with Australia, we can see that the Patent Office applies myriad to nucleotides only. So this doesn't happen at all. The next question we're interested in are whether gene patents are needed for the development of diagnostic tests. And to examine this question, we interviewed cohorts of practitioners about their clients, diagnostic companies, and university TTOs in Europe, both in Europe where genes are patentable and of course in US where they're not. And what we found when we asked them about myriad was that myriad hasn't caused the abandonment of any tests in Europe. But in the US, 1 out of the 6 universities that we interviewed said that they'd stopped developing a test due to myriad. We also asked them about Mayo. And again, we see no change in activity in Mayo. In fact, many European practitioners didn't even think about the case, and university technology transfer officers hadn't heard of it. But in the US, we actually saw that 4 of the 6 interviewed TTOs said that they'd stopped developing one test, at least one test, because of the decision. So what we concluded here was that narrowing of patent rights in the US affected patent precarious organizations, those that rely heavily on patents for competitive advantage because they have no other forms of competitive advantage, which we often see at universities because they don't hold trade secrets, nor have things like manufacturing. But the other interesting thing here was that the decisions in the US only affected US organizations. And this was unexpected because the US remains the primary patenting territory for all of these organizations. I can talk more about that at the end. That was quite unexpected. So now I'd like to turn to the future of Article 27.3b here. So this begins with Article 27.1, where we have to go back to when it says patents shall be available for any inventions in all fields of technology. So during the convergence, the Australian Senate discussed or analysed a possible exclusion for gene patents. This is even before the myriad decision. And they asked for submissions from various parties. And in their report, they said many submitters argued an exclusion of gene patents would conflict with the definition of TRIPS on Article 27.1. One party making this was the Australian Law Council. However, they also said others considered the concept of invention would allow the exclusion. So there's a lot of confusion here. Fast forwarding to the divergence, the US Supreme Court did not address TRIPS, but the Australian High Court did, and the majority said that the materials and submissions before the court offered no basis for inferring that Australia has an obligation in TRIPS to recognise gene patents and inventions. And perhaps a clearer statement of this comes from the Max Planck in their Declaration of Patents, Patent Protection in 2014. And they said states have considerable discretion in implementing TRIPS. They may, for example, deny product and process patents for biological material, even if it has been isolated or purified. So if that's correct, that there's flexibility in 27.1 for gene patents, then there's an underlying question here of why reform Article 27.3b for gene patents. And I think we should mind as we look at these reform options again. Now, the first reform option was to amend the Article 27.3b to prohibit patents on all living organisms and their parts, including genes, and this would be a mandatory exclusion. So I think there's an advantage here in that it's very clear, but we can query how certain, because remember the study looking at the borderline was that it's fairly hazy about where we draw that border, even if we say gene patents cannot be validly granted. It is possible that there's a boost to R&D. This was hinted at by the US Supreme Court in their decision and the Australian High Court, but there's no systematic evidence of that. In fact, papers by Walshall point the opposite way. This reform option also has, I think, significant disadvantages. There's evidence to harm to patent precarious developers. There's perhaps unintended effects on other patent claims, such as pharmaceutical compositions, and would require the EU to reform legislation and went through a 10-year democratic process. This is also a lot of work for no clear gain because, as I showed, the number of gene patents has plummeted, and this is probably largely due to novelty and inventive step. So I'm not sure that's the greatest reform option here. Another option is to repeal the article with no mention of optional exclusions for plants or DNA, etc. And this would have the advantages of conserving the current situation with regards to member state flexibility under Article 27.1. However, I think this also has a significant disadvantage in that the situation for isolated DNA claims remains unclear, even to people with patent law. And this might include countries that are still updating or coming to grips with their patent law, let alone commercialization managers, economists, civil servants, politicians, or inventors that have no training in patent law. The third option, the reform option, was to retain the article without amendment. Again, this has the advantage of conserving flexibility under 27.1. But this option still has the same disadvantage of the situation for isolated DNA being unclear, the same disadvantage for the reform option 2. One of the differences between reform option 2 and reform option 3 here is that the option 3 retains the flexible exclusion for plants and animals. But because I'm not focusing on that today, these two options effectively have the same advantages and disadvantages. Which leads us on to reform option 4, retain the article and provide clarifications and definitions. And here we could clarify that isolated DNA and perhaps other parts of living organisms can be excluded under Article 27.1, perhaps use some of the wording from the Max Planck Declaration. This has an advantage in that it retains the flexibility under 27.1. I also think this is relatively uncontroversial. It is also low effort and allows delegates to concentrate on bigger issues, such as the interface with the CBD, and aligns with different, and one of the reasons it's uncontroversial is it allows different member states to develop their own perspective on patentable subject matter. There is a disadvantage, and I think this is a significant disadvantage, in that it's a compromise for those who believe strongly that isolated DNA should be patentable and those who believe it should not. But I don't fall into any one of those camps, and I don't think the evidence falls either way. I also think that member states should have their own flexibility here. So to conclude then, I think the best option would be to add a clarification or definitions in Article 27, stating that gene patents and perhaps other isolated material from nature can be excluded under the concept of invention in Article 27.1. Some might consider this conclusion very simple, and perhaps many would consider it's consistent with centuries-old patent law principles. However, this conclusion also comes from decades of studying gene patterns and a modern understanding of the cases. In this respect, then, I think it's more accurate to describe this conclusion. A more accurate description of this conclusion comes from the Nobel Prize-winning poet T.S. Eliot, who said, "We shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." And then I'd just like to acknowledge my people who've contributed to this research and the colleagues in the studies over the years. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, John, for taking us through, if you like, some of the core patent law issues that TRIPS has brought to the fore. I now turn to our final speaker, who I've also been looking forward to very much, José van Overvaar from the University of Leuven. As you'll see from her CV, she's done a great deal of research in this area, particularly looking at innovation structures, and has been active in advising the EU and others. And I might say one of the great collaborators in this field, I would say, and she's been very effective in drawing together research from a wide range of sources. So I'm very much looking forward to her presentation. Please, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony, for this very kind introduction. A warm welcome to all of you from freezing cold Belgium. Temperatures below zero, -8, it's very unusual, but we have this exchange of ideas to warm us up. So I will focus on open innovation, patents and biotechnology, and then look at the COVID pandemic as an example of how open innovation, patents and biotechnology interact. And to ginger you up, let me start with this question. What, according to you, is the difference between a pill and a DVD? I hope you've made up your mind. There are various answers to this question, but I've selected those two objects to introduce you to the topic of innovation in a somewhat unparticular way. I don't want to focus on patentable subject matter, as John so eloquently did. So I'm not focusing on the characteristics of the invention. What is developed? Is it patentable? Rather, I'm interested here in the way these objects are being developed, the pattern of innovation. So the process rather than the product, not what is developed, but how is it developed? Then to explore what the role of patents is in this process of innovation. And once again, I will not focus on patentability questions or the major question, indeed, is this patentable subject matter or not? I'm interested in how the patents are being shared. To then turn to the COVID pandemic to test both concepts of innovation and the role of patents. And then ultimately see how the TRIPS agreement has played a role in both innovation and patenting and sharing. So this pill is a prototype of what we call closed innovation. Closed innovation is a term coined by Chesbrough, managerial economics. And he presents this funnel to explain what closed innovation is. Closed innovation is a type of innovation where research and development take place within one company, within one silo. So research projects are being set up, screened, deleted, dropped within one firm, and then selected. The successful ones are selected to be brought to the market. So lots of attention on what is called internal technology basis. The DVD is kind of the school type example of the reverse of open innovation. And here Chesborough pulls up the same funnel, but with holes, little holes. And what happens here is that companies and firms, and he used to work at IBM, so he witnessed that within his own sector, that companies want to make use from knowledge which comes from both internal research labs, but also from external bases. And further, so there's inbound innovation, what he calls inbound innovation, and outbound innovation. And the formal official economic definition, which has been put forward for the last 10, 15 years, is that open innovation is the use of inflows, inbound innovation, outflows, outbound innovation, of knowledge to accelerate internal innovation and expand markets for external use of innovation. What is meant by the last part is that, well, outbound innovation includes that companies do something with innovations which are left on a shelf, which they don't bring to further fruition. They might license them out. Now, I turn to Joe, and I think Joe would agree with me that this very fancy term, open innovation, in a way is a rebranding of collaboration. In essence, that is what it is signaling. Let's collaborate, let's work together, let's go beyond the silo of our own institution. Now, quite often, when the term open innovation is being used rather than the term collaboration, audiences have the intuition or have the idea that with open innovation comes no patents. And that is not totally correct. What you see is that both closed innovation, but also open innovation make use of patents. What is different then? Well, in closed innovation, as you may expect, there is one patent holder, one major patent holder. Whereas in open innovation, where you have a collaboration between different partners around the globe, you have many patents and many patent holders. So the romance we felt when we heard the term, some of us may have heard when listening to the term open innovation, thinking of open source, doesn't resonate in the same way in a patent context. There are patents. But all the more important when there's innovation, when there's patents, is the way, and it has been already indicated by Dominique, all the more important is then how those patents are being shared. So you preserve the incentive of the patents, all the more important, how are the patents being licensed? And there you can observe over the last years what has been very dominant from the very first day patent acts were put to work are the conventional strategies such as bilateral licenses, which are also being conducted today. You will see that one company will conclude a bilateral in-license and another company might conclude, the same company might conduct a bilateral out-license. However, what the collaboration has spurred is a way to deal with licensing in a more efficient way if there's more than one collaborator. So, and what is kind of new, what we have observed in the last 20, 25 years in the area of biotechnology is new models to share patents. And so new collaborative licensing models. And we've seen patent pools, which were, well, kind of quite common in electronic sector and which made their way into the biotech sector. We've seen clearinghouses, which were like radio on air, were very common in the copyright sector and also found their way into the patent sector. So these were conceptually very exciting times, the last 20, 25 years, in seeing models destined for a certain technical area or models very prominent in a certain legal area being woven in other technical areas or IP domains. One example of a patent pool, and I'll come back to that one, is the medicines patent pool. And the medicines patent pool has been very prominent in current discussions on COVID. So what it mainly does, it collects, it provides a platform, an intermediary, where patent holders come together and deliver their patents to that platform. And then the platform licenses out the technology to, in this case, generic manufacturers. But what is interesting is that the bilateral negotiations between the generic manufacturers and the patent holders no longer has to take place. The patent holders who collaborate with such a pool, they give up their right to exclude. They may want a right of remuneration, but they give up the right to exclude others not to use. And that in itself is a tremendous change of mind. A second patent pool-like initiative is the clearinghouse, which has been referred to by Dominique. It's the international licensing platform where vegetable traits are being collected on a platform, an intermediary. And the slight difference with, and the note of critique here is that the platform only provides a platform to negotiate. You still have to negotiate the price, and the price might be prohibitive to really get access. I won't go into other details regarding the legal setup of a patent pool and the legal setup of clearinghouse and impact. I just wanted to provide those two examples to give you a flavor of whether these new legal models work in practice, and they have been set up. And that brings me to the COVID pandemic. And the question, to what extent the vaccine differs from the pill and the DVD, both in the way they're being developed and the way they're being shared. And it's interesting to learn that, and here I think I side with Joe, and I was excited to see his statistics. From what I've learned, IP patents worked relatively well as an incentive for the development of COVID vaccines. So it was the perspective of getting IP, getting patents that spurred collaboration. So that spurred open innovation. University, industry, industry, university, 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 industry, industry. However, it is my impression that it was pretty conventional in the sense that it was not many partners in those collaborations. It was pretty much limited in amount of partners in the collaboration. At least that's what I've noticed here in Europe. Secondly, what is a bit atypical, and Joe also spoke about that, referred to that, there was also philanthropic funding for not just university, which is kind of an institutional issue, but also for industry. I'll come back to that when I discuss the way in which then the sharing took place. And that is, well, unexpected. The patents did not seem to work well as an incentive regarding the production of the vaccines. In those industry university collaborations, what I've noticed throughout Europe and also especially in my own country and my own university, where we have a top research and development center, they conclude bilateral exclusive licenses. They argue that if we can't conduct exclusive licenses, no industry partner will be interested in bringing the idea and the patent to fruition. What has surprised me even more is that philanthropic funders like the Gates Foundation, but also public funders, Ursula von der Leyen, when she brought together volunteers to set up a big fund to conduct research, nothing was said about sharing patents. Nothing was said about sharing know-how in return for funding. We know that contracts have been conducted. There's no transparency, hardly any transparency about the contracts, but it struck me that as enthusiastic and as wide the engagement and commitment was to put money on the table, as reluctant and lukewarm the position of Europe has been with regard to the sharing of patents. And secondly, despite worldwide declarations, and even my own country in Parliament underscored the need for a patent pool, the patent pool didn't really come to fruition either. So what I learned from this is that patents and voluntary sharing can be problematic. And that is what I would say TRIPS comes in with an extremely important contribution. I think it is well accepted and well known that TRIPS allows for a compulsory license. And that has been established in 2001. And John already referred to the MPI Declaration on Patents. And also that declaration indeed confirms that this is totally within the TRIPS framework and within the TRIPS flexibilities to establish a compulsory license for the production of COVID vaccine. What I think remains problematic, and that's probably got to be a structural shortcoming which will never be solved, is that of course TRIPS has no authority over her member states in the sense that she cannot force member states to introduce such a compulsory license. And that in those countries where compulsory licenses exist, as my country, there's no way in which the WTO, if I'm wrong, I'm open to any suggestions, there's no way in which the WTO can force countries having a compulsory license in place to put it to work. But nevertheless, I think TRIPS, and that has also been said by Dominique, the compulsory license regime helps, how would I say, accept the proprietary nature of patents on the one hand side, and then the idea that it may be balanced with access throughout licensing, and if need be, compulsory licensing. Let me conclude. The paradigm at stake here, be it the medicines patent pool, the vegetable patent pool, any other type of collaborative licensing, is IP. There is IP. The starting point of any sharing is IP. All those new collective, collaborative models start from the property paradigm, who are just to provide an incentive to innovate and who can be put to use to exclude. But at the same time, and that is what is so intriguing about patents, they can also be used as a power base to share and to enforce sharing. And in that regard, they are instruments to include. And I vividly remember the very, very first time I read an article from Anthony Taubman, and he was really a high-level diplomat, one might say, a high-ranking official, and he used the word of paradox. He said, patents and TRIPS embrace this paradox. And I would say TRIPS even gives this paradox of taking out intellectual property rights, to having property to more forcefully enable others to share. I think TRIPS has reinforced that paradox and even gives it more teeth in those cases where patent holders, property holders do not voluntarily share. So I would say that is a huge, important contribution of TRIPS. And I will share this slide in the presentation. From a more conceptual point of view, the compulsory license in both patent pools and clearinghouses revert this exclusionary right in a non-exclusive right in return for a remuneration. And that is a paradigmatic change, which is interesting to observe. And in common parlance, we would probably say that pools, clearinghouses, compulsory licenses create what we call an intellectual knowledge commons. Does that amount to a public good? I would doubt to say that, and we can discuss that further. Now, as a last thought, looking at the future, I would like to invite the WTO to reflect on other technological domains beyond health, because health has been taken care of quite well within the WTO, and where TRIPS could reinforce this sharing ethics, this inclusive potential of IP. And I'm worried, especially worried, that it might be quite hard to infuse that sharing ethics in a flourishing area, the flourishing area of big data. And I'm really concerned that what we've kind of said gained with biotechnology in terms of willingness to share might be come to an end because we look for exclusivity again, but then via data exclusivity. So thinking about sharing and responsible sharing in the area of big data and data exclusivity, I think is one of the big challenges ahead of us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Akochi, for again a really remarkable overview of some complex issues, and I particularly appreciate the way you looped back to respond to our opening presentations. I guess the kind of the meta idea here is that we're also talking about innovation in the way we innovate, and I think that was one of the themes of even of Joe's presentation, that we often say we can't just stick with business as usual, but we are seeing a diversification in the way that innovation takes place. So thank you very much to all the panelists. It was a real tour de force to cover so much territory and to put forward so many interesting and provocative ideas. As someone who sat through the discussions on these issues for a very long time, I'm relieved in a way that there's room for fresh thinking and a reinvigorated conversation. What we've done is we've now moved to the question and answer session, and what we've done is cluster together the questions received in under various themes, and indeed it tracks across quite well to the areas of particular focus of our 5 panelists. But what I'd like to do is put forward those questions and invite you, panelists, to respond very quickly to those issues. What I'd say too is that this is an opening conversation, if like in a fresh dialogue. We recognize that there's a lot of material here. We'll work to make the material available online for follow-up, and also, of course, I'm sure the speakers would be pleased to follow up directly with you if you have a detailed question, because we won't be able to cover a lot of detail now. So the first cluster of questions really concern the commercialization of biotech and the role of intellectual property. And there's two related questions, I guess. One concerns, to what extent should the IP system provide a guarantee of what the question says, a break-even point. This difficulty in this, I think Joe referred to the valley of death, the idea that you can have wonderful IP, you can have legitimate, very well-founded IP rights, and still you might run into regulatory problems, you might run into commercialization difficulties, even though the technology might be wonderful. And the second question concerns to what extent can we improve on the evidence that IP contributes to innovation in this area? What kind of empirical gaps could be addressed? John touched on some empirical discussion, but there's a broader economic question, and I think Dominic mentioned several studies there. But if we could just take up this question. Firstly, how do we deal with the idea that IP, I suppose, would never be a guarantee of success, yet it's as Joe emphasized, is a necessary first step in even getting financing for innovation. And then secondly, how can we, if you like, broaden and strengthen the empirical empirical data about the link between IP and innovation in the biotech sector? Joe, would you maybe like to lead off on that?
I'd be glad to lead off. Thanks, Tony. And it's a really interesting question. I think with respect to the question of how do you, or could you, or should you guarantee some sort of break-even point for entrepreneurs or innovators? I think this problem is a lot more complex than people may realize. What the IP system is doing is mobilizing capital. And as I said, it's mobilizing capital primarily from venture capitalists or other financial sources, stock markets around the world. As I said, the failure rate, it's been very well established and it hasn't changed too much, is over 90% from the human clinical trial stage. Okay, that's really beyond dispute. So what the break-even point is the question is to get that one product out of the pipeline isn't a question of how much it costs to develop that specific product. It's a question of how much it costs to develop all 10 products to produce that one product. If you just focus on the cost of that one product, you're just looking at the tip of the iceberg, literally, because it's about the same cost. And if you only say, well, okay, this is how much it costs to develop this one product, this is how much we're going to pay for it. That is really not looking at the whole system of risk and reward that went into producing that one product. So what does it mean? What is the break even for that one product? Well, the break even is whatever it takes to create the ecosystem that allowed for the 10 projects leading to that one success, not simply paying off the person who was successful. Because if that's the case, what you'll end up doing is reducing the amount of capital by probably 90%, and then it becomes a downward spiral. That would be my response to it. So I don't know what the right answer to that question is. The basic, my answer is I don't know what the right answer to that question is. I just know that looking at simply within one enterprise, what the break-even point is not the right way economically to look at it.
No, thank you, Joe. Now turn to other panelists. Don't feel obliged to respond, but if you please do chip in if you're interested, because we have plenty of other questions for you. But on this question of crossing the valley of death, as they call it, and then more broadly building empirical data about IP and innovation in this area. But please.
I understood the question in a somewhat different way. So you have the pre-grant phase, and that's the phase where there's the development, the submissions of the submittal of the patent application, and then you have the grant of the patent and the post-grant phase. And in the post-grant phase, you have licensing, etc. I think there's, in my understanding, the question may refer to an institutional problem, that the grant phase is given to one authority, whereas oversight over clinical trials and marketing is given to another authority. And especially in Europe, that is the case, because the grant phase of a patent is given to one institution, which is the European Patent Convention, which is not an EU institution. And then the competence to look into all the oversight and regulatory issues is given to the European Union. So if you would want to change that, that would bring along a whole transformation of the institutional setup and the division of competencies within Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe others have other views, understood the question even differently, but that's how I understood it. And from a European perspective, it's not that easy to bring it all together in with one legislature and one authority.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Dominic, go ahead.
Yeah, Tony, I agree, Geertruida, with your comment on that. I think it's really, how do you look at these aspects in the context of an innovation policy, and in that innovation policy, and then also what is the enabling framework to bring these products to the market, where the regulatory comes into play, and all these things. And you really have to look at it in a comprehensive manner. I mean, it's not just an IP element, and it's actually bringing these different policymakers and different groups together to deal with how do we then enable it? How do we enable the innovation? And that is also linked then to what is then the reasonable break-even point. Because indeed, if you only look at it from an IP point of view, you have a whole context, especially in a world where there is like regulatory frameworks, all these different things that play a very important role and have a huge impact on how easy it is to bring products to the market. I mean, look at, for instance, how university, smaller companies work together with bigger companies, have to work together with bigger companies at a certain point in time, because the obtaining the regulatory approval for products is becoming more costly every year and more complex and more risky. So that actually pushes more to the other side, the reasonable break-even point, if you look at it. And I think on the empirical gaps that are there, that is indeed to link to what Joe just said. I mean, it's not only the one product, the one innovation by that one company, but it's really actually looking at how these different things come together for that company. But in that, again, innovation ecosystem, I think, when you want to look for empirical data, maybe John, who has been looking at that, or also economists who looked at that, have some additional views, because that's really complex, but at the same time, very important, because some of these, or many of these data are missing to show people the importance, and maybe also the things where there is efficiency gains when we are looking at what should be done from a policy point of view for the sharing of the benefits and the sharing of all of these societal benefits coming out of innovation.
No, thank you. So we now have quite a shift in focus. We have questions on going well beyond the conventional scope of intellectual property, the question of traditional medical knowledge, and also the relationship between IP protection and biodiversity. So I guess Pierre, you might take the lead on this. I should for those unfamiliar, I should note that while the WTO has done some discussion on the question of traditional knowledge systems, the real work, if I might put it this way, has been done in so far very much in our sister organization WIPO, WIPO, and that would be the go-to place now for a rich discussion on intellectual property and traditional knowledge. However, the question is to point out that communities, mentioning China and Indonesia, there's many others, have used traditional medicines for many years, and the application of the patent system might raise concerns there. The question is how could TRIPS protect traditional medicines that don't fit in with traditional or conventional patent law? The other question, more broadly, a long-running debate, I suppose, about the impact of intellectual property, and I guess patents in particular, whether this contributes to monoculture and limits biogenetic diversity, as the question puts it. But the question sort of flips it around and says, well, can the IP system be turned to prevent mass extinction by protecting endangered, well, as it says, animals or animals on the brink of extinction, I suppose more broadly, to protect endangered genetic resources. Pierre, would you like to have a go at those two questions? The one of
yeah, let me
knowledge and biodiversity. Thanks.
Yeah, let me start with the easy one, which is the one about protecting endangered species. I mean, not really, right? I mean, you declare them protected species and you have armed people shooting poachers on site, then I don't really believe the patent system will offer very much additional protection, right? I mean, what you might do is you might challenge patents that you know, demonstrably had a negative impact, for example, on the harvesting rate of an endangered species in a protected plant. But I mean, that would be a separate law enforcement issue. I don't really think the IP system is the tool for that. When it comes to the traditional knowledge question, I mean, there are two conventional answers to them. And the one is that many of those patents are simply bad patents, right? Where there's not a sufficient acknowledgement of the fact that the traditional knowledge is prior art and that the claimed invention is not in fact novel. And of course, in the WIPO IGC discussions, that's the argument put forward by the small number of countries who are resisting disclosure of origin, because they say databases would help patent examiners avoid issuing bad patents like that. But there's another way of thinking of it where the traditional knowledge actually constitutes background IP that you would, if you were in a commercial innovation ecosystem, probably have to license in. But because of the doctrine of public domain, which actually, you know, doesn't legally apply or has never really been made to legally apply to traditional knowledge, in the sense that it's communal property, and it has a temporal persistence that many other things don't have. That is where the sense of grievance comes from traditional knowledge holders who see the patents issuing over traditional remedies that they have used for generations, and don't appreciate the fact that, okay, well, there is in fact a patentable invention that was made over that prior art. Except that prior art, they contend, should not be in the public domain and therefore freely available to incorporate into an innovation, because it's never been placed legitimately into the public domain. So a better way of thinking of it would be background IP that you might need to license in from a competitor or from a collaborator. And I believe if we were to focus on, firstly, the rights-based approach, that people have rights to their cultural goods, and also that protecting traditional lifestyles is an important way of protecting biocultural diversity, which is the fountain of biodiversity. A much more reasonable way of resolving this would be to say, look, if you're going to use traditional knowledge to inspire an innovation, then conclude benefit sharing agreement either with the traditional knowledge holder, or set in place some sort of global mechanism where a percentage of the income from successful IP then gets channeled into supporting those lifestyles that are good for biodiversity.
Great, thank you, Pierre. We're running out of time. but we have several really valuable, interesting questions to pursue. So if there's a bit of scope, we could run over time a little bit. The next cluster of questions really gets us into the heart of patent law as such, and the question that's been discussed just for, particularly in John's presentation, the scope for exclusion of certain subject matter from patent law. And the questions, there's several questions, but the gist of it is that there have been several recent decisions concerning, for example, the broccoli decision in the European Patent Office, and transgenic cotton patent in the US that was revoked on the basis that genetic transformation was a known technique. The question really is, what's the implications of these exclusions? Is this an issue for innovation as such, or is this in effect the natural balancing of the patent system? John, would you like to comment on those decisions and their broader relevance for innovation in general?
Yeah, I haven't looked at the broccoli or tomato decisions for a while now, but one of the things that's interesting coming from an Australian point of view, as I'm sure you know, Anthony, is that actually the plant and animal exclusions found in the EPC and reflected in TRIPS, you know, they're optional TRIPS and they're not implemented in Australia. And the decisions we see in Europe, I think, obviously they're a product of the EPC and the interpretation. And I think one of the things we have to accept that when we come to some of these exclusions is that they are always controversial, but they're going to turn on various ways of interpreting legislation or prior court decisions. And we also see that in the myriad decision in Australia versus the myriad decision in the States. There's different ways of implementing these things. And I think that there's freedom within Europe to move those. There's freedom within TRIPS. It would take in Europe amending the EPC, and there's a established system to do that. And so I think there'd have to be various lobbying efforts to move that forward. In terms of empirical data on it, I'm not sure if there is actually any strong empirical data pointing each way on innovation, and I'm sure there'd be quite strong advocates of for and against any reform there.
So it's the ideal academic answer. More research is needed.
Well, actually,
to all academics.
Well, I would like to point out I did actually make a recommendation in my talk, but I think I'd like to back up to that empirical question that you mentioned a while ago, just to cover it quickly. I spend a lot of time on empirical data, and I think one of the ways forward for empirical data in IP is to break down our traditional disciplines. So if I can generalize for a moment, economists often focus on markets or products, management studies focus on case studies, and lawyers often on doctrine. And I think the greatest advances that we've seen recently are when they break down and there's genuine collaboration between these disciplines. Then we can start answering some fairly nuanced questions and paving the way forward. And I think that would probably help in the protection of or exclusions of plants and animals in Europe.
Right, thank you, John. Now that the next cluster concerns agriculture in particular, and this I think is initially, at least in your domain, Dominic, indeed, because it refers to you directly, the question. You mentioned that the emphasis on balance in the IP system. So it asks your view on balancing the TRIPS agreement as such with farmers' rights, a concept that we're familiar with from the FAO International Treaty on Plant and Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. Would you like to comment on that? Maybe get a little background on these concepts and your take on how we can reconcile these two systems, the TRIPS system on the one hand and the International Treaty, the FAO International Treaty on the other.
the concept of farmers' rights has become a very political concept, I think, that's being discussed in many different contexts. And it is also a concept, I think, which is often linked to IP, but which is not only about IP. It's actually balancing and ensuring that the farmers continue to be able to do their agriculture. But at the same time, we have to recognize that there is something like you do breeding, you do development, you have certain IP rights which merit to be recognized. And then you have indeed access and certain activities that farmers can do. What you sometimes hear being stated is that farmers themselves are in a way breeders, and they might be breeders to a certain extent, but at the same time they will access technology that comes from other institutions, companies that are breeding these varieties. So in that sense, mixing the concept of farmers' rights fully with the seeing that as an exemption to IP rights would go quite far actually in that discussion. And I think it's a topic that you have to really look at the different aspects and how you can come to some kind of an agreement on how to ensure that the farmers have balanced access to the technology that they need and are recognized in what they do, but not see it as an ideological discussion against IP, which I feel this is the case in many of the discussions that are currently ongoing. And that actually doesn't help to come to some kind of an agreement or consensus on that position, which is very unfortunate. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, thank you for that. And indeed, this is a long-running debate that itself has been the subject of many conferences in itself. One question, and I'd like to thank Dina from the University of Gajah Mada in Indonesia, clearly staying awake very late at night to keep in touch with us. So her question deserves airing. In particular, it's to Khajui, concerning your experience and your university's experience in the sharing of patents and the linkage of university patenting with the industry sector. Would you like to comment on that in terms of your own experience or what you've observed in the University of Leuven?
That is a very delicate thing to do because there's the position of my university, and with the many European universities and American universities, and my personal opinion. Let's start with the first one. There's probably an explanation why, but since a few decades, universities have kept away from the Mertonian philosophy of the gift and stepped into what Pierre has called neoliberal ways of innovating and providing incentives for innovation. There's probably good reasons. They have to do with public funding, etc. But it's, as a fact of the day, universities take part in this industrial complex of innovation and IP. My university is one of the top universities where incomes in the billions are being generated by income from patents. Not that many patents are successful, but we have a few golden winners like TPA at the time, tissue plasminogen activator. Personally, although I do understand the impulse for universities to take part in this interaction between a duty to share as scientists and an interest in patenting, I personally think that, especially now in the COVID pandemic, my university is not very courageous because they have taken out patents, they have conducted licenses with other industries. And I would think it would be more courageous if my university would force those industries to share the patents. I wouldn't necessarily say to do it for free. That would remain to be seen, but I don't see much pressure from the universities to live up to their societal commitment. it's a difficult question. It's a difficult issue. There's many layers to it. So the common default regime is we take part in the patenting arena. We step into the patenting arena, and we try to balance that with our societal commitment. But they're not very courageous in sometimes saying, for the sake of healthcare, for the sake of progress, this time we put pressure on our partners to do it differently.
All right, well, thank you. We are nearing, well, we're actually run over time already, but I can't resist offering our panelists a chance to sum up and to offer some parting thoughts. And you might like to consider, and this has been covered in your presentations, but reflections on the overall impact of TRIPS over 25 years and ideas for taking this framework together, forwards rather, for taking it forwards in the future. Could I ask the panelists in the order of presentation to offer some concluding thoughts? Joe, would you like to wrap up?
Sure. Thank you. I'm trying to collect my thoughts after hearing all of these presentations. I would just say that, and I've heard some very provocative presentations today, which I very much value. I think that there's clearly a lot of thought to be given about how the global system evolves. I would say, I just want to leave people with a couple of thoughts. One is that the nature of intellectual property rights for these new technologies is changing rapidly. I talked about gene and cell therapies. I think some of you have probably studied this or looked at it. Proprietary know-how that goes into developing, manufacturing, and delivering those technologies is by no means limited to patents. And often it has to do with very deep experience with patients and with regulators. It's not that easy to transfer, in particular because it deals with small populations. If we're talking about personalized medicine and narrowly defined genetic diseases, this is not the generic model. These aren't pills. I mean, it's just a simple thing, and they're not being manufactured so much. They're being, they're being developed by things like gene therapy in controlled conditions that have been regulated for years and developed in close coordination with regulators. I think we have to look at, and as I said, that's what's in the pipeline now. In the next 5 or 10 years, this is what's coming out of the pipeline. And the discussion we're having around patents, while important, doesn't encompass the issues that are going to surround access to these new technologies. We need to start talking about that. And because the models, it's just not that simple. You're going to have to cooperate with the originator, or else regulators just aren't going to approve the dissemination of those technologies by third parties, let's say, to patients. It's just too dangerous. You're playing with their genes. So, I think there's a lot of discussion that should go on there. Secondly, I just want to reiterate what I said about climate change and everything. I think that you are going to see, and you already are seeing, a flowering of technologies. We can't know exactly where it goes, but there needs to be a discussion around that too, about how the sector can contribute to that, and how much global cooperation is going to be necessary to do that. So look forward to having that discussion as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And indeed, our one hope for this webinar is that it would open up new lines of conversation, and you've offered 2 very concrete avenues there, which we'll be happy to explore. Dominic, would you like to offer some
some concluding remarks maybe? I think it became clear from the talks of all of us, of all the panelists, that looking at a world that becomes more complicated, that you look actually at a multitude of different issues and different IP, and that you have to reconcile all of that in what I would call the great balancing act. I call it value creation and the sharing, and I think the sharing element came back. And how to find that balance is also a constant discussion, looking at these anchor points that TRIPS provides. I do think that the key anchor points within TRIPS and the principles and all of that still provide very important international guidance. Like we see in ag innovation, you have the patents, you have the variety, you have the exclusivity of data. At the same time, there's constant discussion on exemptions, limitations. Also there, TRIPS provides certain guidance. I think John talked very interesting on the Article 27 and the continued work there. One particular point, and it was a question that came as well, I think, is that what we've seen in agriculture, for instance, through the broccoli and tomato cases and then the pepper case of last year, is that one of the key issues that has led to these long discussions in Europe is the lack of clarity or clear definition to a certain extent of what is, for instance, an essentially biological process, what is explicitly also mentioned in TRIPS. So we see that this will continue to be part of a discussion while we see all of these developments. But it's very important, I think, and that's why this webinar is important, but a continued dialogue with all of the countries and all of the experts going forward, starting from these principles of TRIPS and taking into consideration all of the developments, I think is as important as ever while going forward and dealing with all these societal issues, whether it's COVID, another pandemic, other issues, things happening in different technologies. So it's challenging, and at the same time, it's absolutely urgent to continue the dialogue. I mean, data was referred to by Geertruida as well, I think. That might be another one where we need to look at. We will probably have to look at a certain point in time.
Indeed, one of the questions we just don't have time to address, I'm sorry, raises that question of the link between the management of data and bioinformatics. So yeah, the whole question of innovation in the biotech sector is of course overlapping directly with data questions and even questions of prior informed consent about genetic information that finds its way into the innovation stream. So once again, with apologies to the person asking that question, Dominic, you've touched on it, and clearly that's an area to explore in future and urgently, as you've said. These are dynamic issues, but they're also very pressing issues of concern to us all. Pierre, can I turn to you for some concluding remarks?
Yeah, thank you for okay, so a couple of thoughts. One of them is that I think there's a general agreement of the role that intellectual property plays in incentivizing and rewarding investment in innovation. I think sometimes the motivating role of intellectual property in leading to innovation is overstated. I believe a lot of innovation happens because people are inherently creative. But certainly then bringing those innovations to the wider society and making them sustainable from a financial point of view, intellectual property has a key role to play. I think one of the things that's bedeviling that in the sphere of biology, and especially in access to genetic resources, is the fact that it is the system is kind of being fine-tuned by the powerful people inside it for maximum gain, right? And in fact, there's probably a better solution which looks at optimal balance of rewards and the sharing of those rewards. I mean, in a way, Dominic was referring to that in his when he talked about the growing acceptance of exemptions for small farmers, right? I mean, we saw that 2019 when we were negotiating in international treaty. The industry was actually saying, well, in fact, we're not patenting or we're not taking out plant breeders' rights to force small farmers out of their farms or prevent them from saving their own seed. And I think that you can do the same thing at many different levels where yes, IP is important and it protects important things, but then the sharing of the benefits that come from that and the exemptions and the living space really, for the diversity that is in the innovation system and in the genetic resources space and in traditional knowledge needs to be more it needs to be taken into account in, I agree, a more balanced way, a better balance between the interests of the investor and the interests of the innovator and the interests of society and the interests of smallholders and farmers and people who look after biodiversity would go a long way, I think, to restore the trust and enable the access that is going to be key for the innovations that we would need to make to adapt to climate change and other environmental factors. Because if you keep driving hard IP enforcement on every single point and squeezing every dollar out of a patent, then you will have a pushback at regulatory level. You will have people who are not providing access to genetic resources because they don't trust the system to protect their interests. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you. John, you're one of the panelists who's actually made an extremely concrete proposal for the TRIPS agreement as such. Would you like to offer some more general concluding comments? And possibly with reference to that extra work that needs to be done on the empirical side?
Sure. I think, first of all, we have to reflect that we live in the most incredible technological age, and the acceleration that we've all lived through in the past 25 years since TRIPS has probably, I think most people agree, been the fastest recorded in human history, which is phenomenal. And it's hard to directly link that to TRIPS exactly and intellectual property, but I think most people would agree it's played an important role. And in that respect, I think we should be quite grateful. And it's been so successful to an extent that we see, massive amounts of technological failures that we never talk about. We only focus on the successes, success bias. But the success of IP has been so great to some respect that we ask, what more can it do? And we rightly do. We ask these questions and we ask about the interface between other laws. And one of the reasons these are successful because TRIPS and our world organization to an extent has lots of areas to improve. We've hinted at the CBD, climate catastrophes and benefit sharing. I mean, these are desperately important things that will continue to be debated, and I think that's wonderful. I think there's a step beyond or related to the IP sphere, though, is this, with this massive acceleration of technology, is we've also had now incredible standardization of technology in recent times that was cutting edge only 10 years ago. And what this means is that there's still very good technology that's only 10 years old that can now be used and reformulated, sometimes cheaply or free without patent protection. And this, to my mind, is one of these areas that's definitely underappreciated. But when you think about an IP policy or incentivizing technology, it's one of the key components. You have IP and then you have other areas and other interests that incentivize. And so I think that can often be cheaper innovation that sits alongside IP as we traditionally know it, but is just as important. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there, and that would probably broadly fall within WTO and TRIPS area of interest.
Great, thank you very much, John. And absolutely, not the least, but accidentally the last, Katri, would you like to conclude our presentation?
So my final thoughts, there are many, but I'll restrict them to two. You won't be surprised that one is balance. The second one is uncertainty. So when I talk about balance, I want to take you back to 2005 when I gave a lecture on limits to patent law and dysfunctionality of patent law, introduced the compulsory license in Belgium. People would just call me a communist and ask me to leave the room. That was 2005. 2021 is quite different. If I now speak about a compulsory license at a conference with an audience with pharma, with Belgian pharma, it's not that they like it, but they're used to the idea that there's limits to the way in which they can exploit their patents. So I would say that's good news, but I still have two concerns. What we've seen in the BRCA case, and John will probably side with me, is that thanks to all the oppositions which have been started by governments in Europe, the patents have either been validated or narrowed down. But what did the patent holder do? They gave up on patents and tried to establish a system of return on investment via data exclusivity. So all the tissue had to go to Utah, was being looked into in Utah. And whereas previously the results were out in the open, the results of all the tests were made public, the company started doing that and kept it secret. So there was confidentiality of the results. And then there was a citizens initiative where women then said, oh, but we'll do it personally, we'll do it privately. And then you had a database where all the information was then put in the open again. So it's bad news and good news at the same time, because the bad news is there will always be companies which will want to use the patents to their very limits for maximization of profit. The good news is there's citizens who clever enough and active enough to counteract that. So that's the balance and the threat to the balance. Uncertainty. I look at the broccoli cases and the pepper case. And you know what I did, Dominique? I looked into the composition of the enlarged boards of appeal in all those cases. They were all different. They were all different. So maybe in a few years from now, a different board, a different enlarged board who's being presented with the same question for clarity might come up with a different answer. And it will not resolve, I think, the very unpleasant feeling which radiates in those agricultural companies and agricultural society, because it's as if the clock has shifted from one side to another, and where will we be in 10 years from now? And then there was balance and certainty. For the WTO, I would appreciate focusing on FRAND, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. You have them in Europe, you have them in the US. There's an interesting tool which is now being put to work in standardization, but you could imagine that one instrument to govern the balance is explore the FRAND mechanism in other areas. Now, if you do that, this transition from the FRAND concept in other domains, what I've met is resistance, because it requires transparency on what exactly does it mean fair for a company, what exactly does it mean reasonable, and companies are not willing to share that upfront. We have to wait until there are decisions from courts, which then reveal what fair is and what not fair is. And I'm wondering to what extent an organization like the WTO could really get a better grip on that and a better understanding and enforce more upfront transparency.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much for those thoughts. Unfortunately, or fortunately for some, I suppose we really well beyond our time, and I'd just like to wrap up very, very briefly. In a way, taking up Rotu's final themes of balance and yet uncertainty, and I'll just quote one more referred about Article 27 of the TRIPS agreement. I'll quote one more article, that's Article 7, and that's something that I think is embedded in TRIPS and has continuing relevance to this discussion. For those who don't know it off by heart, it says that the intellectual property system should contribute to the promotion of innovation, technological innovation, and to the transfer and dissemination of technology, to the mutual advantage of those who produce and use the technological knowledge, and in a way that's conducive to social and economic welfare. And finally, a balance of rights and obligations. And it's kind of a encouraging that so much of our discussion in initial presentations and in the questions and answers really pivot around these ideas. For me, a key part of this article is the idea of mutual advantage. It is meant to be a positive sum game. It's not that this degree of innovation should rob us of this degree of public welfare, if you like. We've heard about the practical challenges of achieving this, and part of that challenge is that uncertainty. I think this is something that the intellectual property system will always have to grapple with, precisely because it is dealing with innovation and change, a constant moving target. But I think we've also heard that it's not just a moving target in terms of the technology as such, the kind of a hard technology, but also in the way that we work with innovation systems and the way that different elements of society work together, whether it's university, private sector, or whether it's recognizing traditional knowledge systems or those who are custodians of genetic resources. I would still suggest that this very diverse range of views we've heard today still falls within that broad sense that there is a prospect for a positive sum approach where we have the necessary innovation, but also the effective transfer and dissemination, the social and economic positive impact of that innovation. And above all, that famous balance of rights and obligations, which is not an abstract matter, but a very practical matter. It's a balance that finds its way through into very specific decisions on whether or not this thing is patentable, but also more broadly, the idea that, for example, as Quatru's mentioned, universities have a public role as well, and getting that balance right is a constant dynamic challenge. So I hope we've got the balance right, at least in terms of a wonderful array of panelists. We, as I said at the opening, we really didn't ever hope that this would be a comprehensive, thorough analysis of all these issues, but rather a chance to have a fresh look at these issues, and I personally think that's been achieved because it has been a very stimulating set of presentations and questions and answers, but above all, stress that these are very contemporary, pressing issues, that it's not an abstract or, if I might say, a purely political matter. It's a matter of practical concern that affects us all across the globe. So I do very much hope that we can follow up these conversations. I stress that this is, if you like, off Broadway. It's not meant to be an intervention in our government-to-government work, which is so important in the WTO, but we're trying to build up a background of richer understanding and dialogue that we hope in time will support further discussions. I'd like to conclude by thanking very warmly our panelists. As I say, that this was our ideal lineup, and we were thrilled, delighted that they could all accept and take part, and even now, even beyond the scheduled period. I'd like to thank the participants who've joined in and engaged in a very interactive way. A particular recognition of my old friend and colleague Dinah, who I know is in, I guess, in Jakarta, approaching midnight. This is beyond the call of duty. It's a sign of the wonderful breadth of engagement with these issues across the globe, however. And I conclude by thanking the remarkable team that has made this work. One of the impacts over the last year has been to push us into this somewhat innovative online format. It has its benefits, and I think sometimes the discussion can be quite direct and interactive. I think our panelists have managed this very well. But the team responsible for pulling this together, both in terms of the content and the platform that we've all benefited from, led by Xiaoping Wu, my close colleague, and the team including Jessica Van Wilde, Bassam Khazin, Alex Chan, Josefita Pardo de Leon, and Liliana, our indispensable video conference guru who does amazing things to keep us in touch across the globe, and also our colleague Veronica Pini, who manages the administration of this. So thank you all so much. Even though we're joining across the globe, we are complying with one cast iron Geneva tradition in that we have run well over time. Geneva time is not the same as Swiss railroad time. It is somewhat elastic. So I thank you very much, all of you, panelists, participants, my colleagues, for staying a distance with us, for really promoting a really stimulating, enlivening conversation. And I look forward to keeping in touch. Do please, and I speak to obviously to our friends, the panelists, but also to participants, do please keep in touch. There's a lot that's going on, and we see it as our responsibility to do our best to infuse, encourage from our panelists. These are not abstract issues, these are very urgent practical issues. So thank you so much for your engagement, and I wish you all a good evening, a good morning. I don't know where we all are, but thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much for organizing this. And I really, really hope that next time we can meet in person in Geneva and have all the other goodies from Switzerland. I mean, culinary speaking.
If that's a vote for Swiss chocolate over Belgian chocolate, I'll leave that to you to determine. Right, thank you everyone.